The sickeningly familiar scent of burnt coffee and Brenda's cheap perfume assaulted my nostrils. I was 5 minutes late, and I knew because I'd been reborn that she was about to fire me from the cafe again. It was a bizarre feeling, like watching a rerun of the worst day of my life, but this time I wasn't just a spectator. I was supposed to be the star of this tragedy again. I trudged towards the back. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a drummer boy heralding my doom. Or was it an execution? It certainly felt like one. Each step I took echoed with the ghost of my past failure, a life I'd already lived, a pain I'd already endured. But this time, something was different. Underneath the dread, a tiny, rebellious spark flickered. I remembered everything. Brenda, my boss, a woman whose voice could curdle milk, bellowed my name. Her tiny, cluttered office awaited, a cramped stage for her dramatic pronouncements. The air inside was always thick with the smell of stale paper and her overpowering rose-scented spray, a desperate attempt to mask the general dinginess. I braced myself. She gestured to the worn-out chair opposite her messy desk. Papers teetered in precarious stacks, and a half-eaten muffin, probably days old, sat fossilizing on a chipped plate. "Close the door," she commanded, her voice dripping with that false sweetness that always preceded a storm. I did, the click of the latch sounding like a cell door slamming shut. The lecture began, each word a replay of a script I now knew by heart. It was a tirade I'd crumpled under before. She droned on about my supposed infractions. Late again. Customer complaints, which I knew were bogus. Lack of enthusiasm. Her voice grated on my nerves, a horribly familiar soundtrack. The old, familiar panic started to bubble up, threatening to choke me. My hands felt clammy. But then, I remembered. I remembered the humiliation, the tears, the desperate scramble for a new job in that other life. A cold ember of resolve began to glow within me, pushing back the fear. I focused on the chipped paint on her desk, a small island of imperfection in her perfectly constructed narrative of my failings. This time, I didn't fidget. I didn't look away. I met her gaze, my own surprisingly steady. I let her words wash over me, each accusation a wave I'd already surfed. It felt like an eternity before she finally reached her grand finale. "So, you see," she said, leaning back with a sigh that was pure theater. "I have no choice. You're fired." There it was. The two words that had shattered me before. The old me would have pleaded or cried, or maybe just stared in stunned silence. My stomach clenched, a knot of remembered despair. But the new me, the reborn me? I just nodded slowly. A flicker of surprise, or was it annoyance, crossed Brenda's face. She probably expected tears, a dramatic scene. I offered none. This small act of defiance, this refusal to crumble, felt like a tiny victory, a quiet power move that only I understood. She frowned, clearly unsettled by my calm. What was she thinking? Did she expect me to beg for the crummy job that barely paid my rent? She pushed a grubby envelope across the desk. "Your final pay, and the key to your locker. Clear it out before you leave the premises." Her tone was sharp, the feigned sympathy gone. Good. Let her be nasty. It only fueled my strange new strength. I stood up, the movement feeling strangely liberating. "Thank you, Brenda," I said, my voice even. "I didn't mean for the job or the pay, but for the push. The push I needed again." She just grunted, already dismissing me, probably already thinking about who to torment next. Would she ever learn? Or was she doomed to repeat her own petty tyrannies forever? Standing outside the cafe a few minutes later, the key to my old locker felt like a lead weight in my palm. The metal was cold against my skin. The bustling street sounds, the distant wail of a siren, the chatter of oblivious pedestrians. It all felt distant, muffled. I watched Liam, my boyfriend, my coworker, through the large front window. He was wiping down the counter, his back mostly to me, but I saw him sneak a glance. He saw me, and then he deliberately, pointedly looked away, his shoulders hunching. The first betrayal, again. It still stung, a sharp, bitter ache in my chest. But this time, The pain was mingled with a grim understanding. I knew what was coming, the cascade of betrayals that had nearly destroyed me before. The foreknowledge was a bitter pill, but it also steeled me. It hardened my resolve into something sharp and unyielding. They wouldn't break me this time. I wouldn't let them. I clutched the key tightly, the edges digging into my skin, a small, grounding pain. The city air, usually thick with exhaust fumes, suddenly smelled a little like opportunity, a faint, clean scent cutting through the grime. My mind raced, not with panic, but with possibilities. What was my first move in this new, repeated life? My first move, it turned out, was desperation. Rent didn't pay itself, and foreknowledge of impending doom wasn't a skill most employers valued. I pounded the pavement, or rather clicked endlessly on job sites. My fingers ached from typing and my eyes burned from staring at the screen. Finally, I snagged a temporary gig at a catering company. It wasn't glamorous, it was hot, sweaty work, serving lukewarm food at forgettable events. The uniform was a hideous shade of beige and always smelled faintly of old grease and despair. One afternoon, while I was wrestling with a mountain of dirty dishes, the clatter echoing in the industrial kitchen, Liam showed up. He leaned against the doorframe, trying to look cool and concerned, but mostly just looking out of place. He smelled like the cheap diner food from the greasy spoon near Brenda's cafe, a scent that now clung to him, replacing the once pleasant aroma of coffee and cinnamon from our shared shifts. He feigned sympathy about Brenda, his words smooth and practiced. "So unfair what she did to you, babe," he cooed, his eyes not quite meeting mine. Then came the subtle digs. "Catering, huh? Well, it's something to keep you busy, right?" He smirked, that infuriating little twitch of his lips. He thought I was crushed, vulnerable. I let him think it. I conjured up a wobbly smile and sighed, playing the part of the defeated girlfriend. "Yeah, well, gotta pay the bills," I mumbled, shrugging. Inside, I seethed. This new job grated on my nerves, and his mockery amplified my frustration. The constant pressure to find something stable, something real, gnawed at me. This gig was a flimsy bandage on a gaping wound of financial worry. Little did he know, his condescension just added more fuel to my slowly burning fire. What could he possibly be scheming now, I wondered, as he gave my shoulder a patronizing squeeze. A few weeks into my catering adventure, disaster struck, or rather, history repeated itself with an extra dose of stupidity on my part. In a moment of weakness, a moment where the old life and the new one blurred, I'd rashly mentioned my signature pastry idea to Liam. It was a unique spiced apple tart with a crumb topping I'd perfected in my dreams and in my previous life. I'd even jotted down the ingredients on a napkin when he'd whined about needing something new to impress Brenda. I'd forgotten, just for a fatal second, who he really was, who he would become. I cursed myself for that slip. My brain felt like scrambled eggs sometimes, trying to keep past and present straight. Predictably, Liam, still cozy at Brenda's cafe, presented my spiced apple tart recipe as his own brilliant invention. Brenda, ever the opportunist, launched it as the cafe's new autumn harvest delight. The local paper, a flimsy sheet that always felt rough under my fingers, even ran a small gushing piece about the cafe's innovative new treat. It became an instant hit. Customers raved. Liam got the credit, a smug photo in that same local rag, and I later heard a hefty raise. He paraded his success, basking in the undeserved glory. The anger that surged through me was hot and fierce. He actually believed I didn't know how to prove it was mine. He thought I was just that pathetic girl he could walk all over. Oh, how wrong he was. He imagined I'd just weep into my pillow. He probably pictured me confronting him, making a scene, which he would then twist to make me look unhinged. That's what the old me might have done. But the reborn me? I had other plans. I remembered something crucial from my past life. Liam, for all his supposed cleverness, was an arrogant fool online. He loved to brag, to posture, to hear the virtual applause. And he especially loved to mock things before he decided to steal them. A wicked little smile played on my lips. My fingers flew across the keyboard of the ancient library computer, the keys clacking softly in the quiet room. The stale, dusty smell of old books filled the air, a surprisingly comforting scent for the devious task at hand. It didn't take long. Bingo, old forum posts, social media comments from years ago before he even knew me. There they were, Liam in all his glory, ridiculing the very idea of fancy apple tarts. He'd called them something only a grandma would bake, and a pretentious waste of good apples. The irony was delicious. I took screenshot after screenshot, the bright flash of the screen capturing his hypocrisy. My heart pounded with a mix of excitement and nerves. I knew just who to send them to. A local food blogger, Culinary Carla. A woman whose sharp reviews and even sharper tongue Liam had publicly scorned after she gave Brenda's Cafe a lukewarm write-up months ago. He'd called her a bitter wannabe critic. Oh, this was going to be good. I drafted an anonymous email attaching the damning evidence. I hit send, a small, decisive click that echoed louder than any shout could. I felt a shiver of anticipation. Would she take the bait? The expose dropped 3 days later. It was a masterpiece of journalistic savagery, all wrapped up in Carla's signature snarky style. The headline screamed, "Bitter brew at Brenda's, cafe accused of stealing sweet success." Carla didn't hold back. She laid out the timeline, my anonymous claims of developing the pastry, and then the pièce de résistance. Liam's old post displayed in glorious, embarrassing detail, mocking the exact type of pastry he now claimed as his genius creation. The contrast was brutal, undeniable. It seems Mr. Liam Thorne has a flexible palate and even more flexible ethics, Carla wrote, her words dripping with sarcasm. 1 minute he's decrying apple tarts as pedestrian, the next he's hailed as the local king of autumnal baking. One has to wonder if his memory is as short as his list of original ideas. The blog post went viral in our small community. Phones buzzed, shares racked up. The comment section was a dumpster fire of public opinion, roasting Liam to a crisp. Liam was publicly shamed, his smug face wiped clean of its usual arrogance when I glimpsed him skulking down the street later that week, his shoulders hunched. He looked like a dog caught raiding the garbage, which, metaphorically, he had. Brenda's Cafe, once a source of local pride, was suddenly drowning in negative press. Idea theft, dishonest practices, employee exploitation. Those were the phrases being tossed around. The sweet smell of my revenge was far more satisfying than any pastry. The cafe's reputation, so carefully cultivated by Brenda, began to crumble like a day-old scone. The public fallout was swift and brutal, just as I'd hoped. I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile. This was only the beginning. But as the dust began to settle, a new, chilling thought surfaced. Brenda was not the type to take this lying down. She would retaliate. The question was, how? The sweet, sweet taste of Liam's public humiliation and Brenda's Cafe's tarnished reputation didn't last nearly long enough. It was like eating one perfect, tiny chocolate delicious, but then it's gone, and you just want more. I knew Brenda. She wasn't the type to quietly lick her wounds. She was more like a cornered badger, all teeth and fury. And I had a horrible, sinking feeling I knew who she'd lash out at. My phone buzzed a few days later, a shrill, angry sound that made me jump. It was Mr. Harrison, my catering manager. His voice, usually jovial and booming, was clipped and cold. "Sarah, I need to talk to you. There's been a complaint." My stomach plummeted. I gripped the phone and my knuckles white. "A complaint?" I echoed, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. The background noise of the busy catering kitchen, usually a comforting chaos of clanging pots and shouted orders, suddenly felt oppressive. "Yes," he said, and I could almost hear the frown in his voice. "From a Brenda Marlowe, your previous employer. Ring any bells?" Oh, it rang bells, all right. It rang alarm bells, fire bells, the whole belfry. "She claims you were let go for theft, stealing from the till to be precise." Even over the phone, I could smell the stale, rotten scent of Brenda's lies, a phantom stench from her cluttered little office. My blood ran cold, then boiled with a sudden hot rage. "That witch," I stammered a denial, of course. That's absolutely not true, Mr. Harrison. She fired me because I was late a few times, that's all." My voice cracked, and I hated how weak I sounded. He hummed, a non-committal sound that sent shivers of dread down my spine. Well, she seemed quite convinced. Said she didn't report it to the police to give you a chance, but feels she has to warn other employers. Give me a chance? More like give herself a chance to stab me in the back. I felt a wave of despair wash over me, so potent it almost buckled my knees. This was her game, to ruin me, to make sure I couldn't even serve lukewarm chicken skewers in peace. Was I going to lose this job too? All because of her vicious, baseless accusations? It seemed my reborn life was determined to follow the most painful parts of the old script. But as Mr. Harrison continued, explaining he'd have to look into it, a different kind of resolve began to push through the despair. It was cold and hard, like a diamond. Brenda wanted to play dirty? Fine. I could get downright filthy. I feigned utter devastation on the phone, letting my voice crack with unshed tears, promising I'd never do such a thing. He sounded a little less stern by the end, maybe even a tad sympathetic. All right, Sarah, we'll talk more later. After I hung up, the feigned despair solidified into icy determination. Brenda thought she was clever. She thought she could control the narrative with her lies, but she'd forgotten about the skeletons in her own closet. Or rather, the skeletons I knew about from my previous life's involuntary tour of her dirty laundry. A very specific skeleton came to mind. Mr. Henderson, Brenda's perpetually stressed accountant. I remembered overhearing hushed, angry arguments between them, something about supplier invoices and creative bookkeeping. Brenda had been secretly cheating him, and by extension, the business, on a dodgy supplier deal for months, maybe years. The memory sparked like a faulty wire, and here's where my strange, reborn existence handed me an ace. In my previous life, after being fired, I'd obsessively gone over my time at the cafe, trying to understand what I'd done wrong. In doing so, I'd mentally cataloged everything, including a lot of inventory and sales data I'd helped process. This time around, with that foreknowledge lingering in the back of my mind, I had been almost compulsively meticulous. During my shifts, I'd kept quiet, duplicate notes of daily sales, inventory adjustments, and even delivery discrepancies. I hadn't known exactly why, just that some instinct screamed at me to document everything. Those notes were currently tucked away in a battered shoebox under my bed, feeling as heavy as gold bars. My plan began to form, a beautiful, intricate web. I couldn't just march up to Mr. Henderson and hand him my evidence. That would point right back to me, and Brenda would just scream louder. No, this had to be subtle, anonymous even. I needed him to discover it. The next day, I called in sick to the catering job, my voice genuinely hoarse from a sleepless night of plotting. I spent the morning carefully transcribing my handwritten notes into neat, typed spreadsheets. They showed the actual sales figures, the real inventory counts, starkly contrasting with what I knew Brenda was likely reporting. The hum of my old, borrowed laptop was a quiet soundtrack to my scheming. Then, I remembered that Mr. Henderson often took a mid-morning coffee break at a small park near his office. A very specific bench, in fact, where he liked to read the paper. The details from my past life were proving remarkably useful. Later that morning, armed with a plain manila envelope containing printouts of my meticulously kept records, I headed to that park. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. The air in the park was fresh, smelling of damp earth and blooming flowers, a stark contrast to the deceit I was about to sow. I saw him, Mr. Henderson, right on schedule, a lonely figure on his usual bench, lost in his newspaper. With trembling hands, I nonchalantly dropped the envelope near the edge of the bench as I walked past, pretending to be engrossed in a phone call. I didn't look back. Did he see it? Would he even pick it up? The suspense was almost unbearable. I didn't have to wait long to find out if my little seed of chaos had taken root. 2 days later, whispers started circulating through the town's gossip mill, which, in our small community, operated faster than fiber optics. Mr. Henderson, apparently, had stumbled upon some very interesting documents. Cross-referencing these anonymous records with Brenda's doctored books, he hadn't just found the supplier discrepancies he'd long suspected, he'd unearthed a much larger pattern of embezzlement. Brenda wasn't just cheating him. She was systematically bleeding the cafe dry from the inside. The numbers didn't lie, even if Brenda did. Mr. Henderson, a man I remembered as quiet and browbeaten, had apparently found his backbone. He reported her to the authorities, to the taxman, to anyone who would listen, it seemed. Suddenly, Brenda's cafe wasn't just dealing with a PR nightmare about a stolen pastry. It was the subject of a full-blown financial investigation. The words fraud and embezzlement clung to Brenda's name like her cheap perfume. Suppliers, already wary after the pastry scandal, started demanding cash up front or outright refusing to deliver. The cafe, once a bustling hub, began to feel like a ghost ship. Lights on, but nobody home. The clatter of cups and happy chatter I used to associate with the place was replaced by an eerie silence in my mind. Brenda's carefully constructed world was crumbling. Her reputation was in tatters. She looked harried and old when I caught a glimpse of her rushing into her solicitor's office, her face pale and drawn. It was a beautiful sight, a masterpiece of self-destruction, aided by a little anonymous nudge. But even as I savored this victory, a cold knot of unease tightened in my stomach. Brenda was a fighter, a nasty, tenacious one. Was this enough to finally ruin her, or would she somehow manage to wriggle out of this mess too, more furious and vengeful than ever? The anxiety of waiting to see if Brenda would wriggle free from her financial mess gnawed at me. She was like a particularly nasty weed. You thought you'd pulled it out, but a tiny piece of root always seemed to remain, ready to sprout again. My catering job with Mr. Harrison was surprisingly understanding after the Brenda-generated storm in a teacup. He'd muttered something about vindictive ex-bosses and let it go, especially since no actual evidence ever appeared. I was grateful, but the work was still grueling. The smell of lukewarm gravy a constant reminder that this wasn't my path. Then, one evening, as I was soaking my aching feet in a bowl of hot water, the steam rising in comforting clouds, a strange memory surfaced. It floated up from the depths of my past life, hazy and indistinct at first, like a dream you can't quite grasp. Aunt Mildred, my mother's estranged older sister, a woman I'd met only a handful of times as a child. I remembered hearing, vaguely, that she had passed away a few years before. Well, before my first life ended. And there was something else, a tiny, overlooked detail. She might have left me something. A small inheritance, quickly dismissed by my then grieving and overwhelmed self. I'd never pursued it, never even thought to ask. This time, a jolt of electricity shot through me. Why hadn't I remembered this sooner? My mind raced. What if? I couldn't shake the feeling, a persistent nudge from my reborn consciousness. The very next morning, I started making calls. It took some digging, like an archaeologist hunting for a lost relic. Finally, I found the name of the law firm that had handled her estate. My heart thumped a nervous rhythm as I dialed their number, the plastic of my cheap phone feeling slippery in my sweaty palm. The lawyer's office was downtown in one of those old, grand buildings that smelled of history and important documents. The air inside was cool and still, thick with the scent of old paper, leather-bound books, and a faint hint of lemon polish. It was the smell of possibility, of secrets waiting to be unearthed. Mr. Abernathy, the lawyer, was a kind, elderly man with eyes that seemed to hold a gentle wisdom. He peered at me over his spectacles. "Sarah Jenkins?" he asked, his voice a soft rumble. "Yes, we've been holding something for you from Mildred Weatherby's estate for quite some time." My breath caught in my throat. "Something?" I managed to squeak out. He smiled faintly. He explained that Aunt Mildred, despite her eccentric and solitary life, had been a surprisingly shrewd investor. The small overlooked inheritance wasn't small at all. As he detailed the asset's stocks, a small property she'd rented out, some bonds, my jaw practically hit the polished mahogany desk. The numbers he quoted made my head spin. It was more money than I had ever dreamed of seeing in one place. Enough to do something serious. Enough to change everything. I felt a wave of dizziness and grasped the armrest of the plush leather chair, its worn texture a grounding sensation. Walking out of that office an hour later, the city streets seemed brighter. the usual cacophony of traffic sounding almost like a triumphant symphony. My mind was a whirlwind. While Brenda was flailing, tangled in her legal and financial nightmares, opportunity hadn't just knocked, it had kicked the door down. A few days later, a new whisper reached me on the ever-reliable town grapevine. Brenda's cafe, already crippled by the scandals and her rapidly dwindling funds, was quietly, desperately on the market. The for sale sign wasn't even up yet, but the news was spreading like wildfire among those in the know. She needed cash, fast, to cover her mounting legal fees and angry creditors. The price I heard was laughably low for a once thriving business. A wicked, brilliant idea sparked in my mind, so audacious it made me grin. This was it. This was my chance. But I had to move quickly. Someone else might snap it up. Or worse, Brenda might find some last-minute lifeline, some way to claw herself back from the brink. The thought spurred me into action. The ticking clock was deafening in my ears. I called Mr. Abernathy again the next day. "I have a rather unusual proposal," I began, my voice trembling slightly with a mixture of excitement and sheer audacity. I explained what I wanted to do. He listened patiently, a small, intrigued smile playing on his lips as I laid out my plan to use a shell company fronted by his firm to make an anonymous offer on the cafe. He was, to my immense relief, not only willing, but seemed rather tickled by the idea. A bit of poetic justice, perhaps? He'd chuckled, the sound like rustling leaves. The next few weeks were a blur of paperwork and hushed phone calls. Mr. Abernathy's firm set up Phoenix Enterprises, a name I'd chosen with a smirk. We drafted the offer, carefully calculated to be just enough to tempt a desperate Brenda, but not so high as to arouse suspicion. The waiting was torture. Every time my phone rang, I jumped, my nerves screaming. Would she accept? Would she somehow guess? I pictured her, pacing her disastrously empty cafe, the once proud owner now cornered and frantic. Then the call came. Mr. Abernathy's calm voice on the other end. "Miss Jenkins, Phoenix Enterprises has an accepted offer." Brenda, blinded by her desperation for cash and the anonymity of the buyer, hadn't scrutinized a thing. She'd snatched at the lifeline, eager to unload the albatross around her neck. My breath hitched. A wave of triumph, so pure and potent, washed over me, making me feel lightheaded. I could almost hear the satisfying thud of a gavel. The contracts were drawn up with impressive speed. A few days later, I sat in Mr. Abernathy's office again. The scent of old paper now mingled with the crisp, clean smell of freshly printed documents. He slid a thick sheaf of papers across the desk towards me. "Sign here, here, and here," he instructed, pointing with a silver pen. My hand was surprisingly steady as I signed each page, my signature a bold stroke of fate. He then stamped them with an official-looking seal, the sound echoing with finality in the quiet room. He smiled, a genuine broad smile this time. "Congratulations, Miss Jenkins," he said, extending his hand. Or should I say, congratulations, Phoenix Enterprises. I shook his hand, a thrill coursing through me. It was done. The cafe, Brenda's beloved cafe, the scene of my past humiliation and the target of her current downfall, was mine. The cafe was mine. The words echoed in my mind, a sweet, unbelievable melody. For a few days, I existed in a strange limbo, the secret clutched tight to my chest like a precious, fragile bird. Mr. Abernathy handled the final, boring legal bits, the transfer of funds, the official notifications. Brenda, blissfully unaware of who Phoenix Enterprises truly was apparently just relieved to have the sale finalized, the money in her desperate hands. The day of the handover was set. I woke that morning with a strange mix of nervous energy and icy calm. This was it. The culmination of so much pain, so much planning. I chose my outfit carefully. Not a power suit, nothing too obvious. Just simple, neat clothes that made me feel confident, like myself. As I walked towards the cafe, the familiar street seemed different, charged with a new significance. Each crack in the pavement, each storefront I passed felt like a milestone on my journey back to this place. I wondered what Brenda would be doing, how she'd be feeling. Probably trying to put on a brave face for the corporate buyers she imagined were about to arrive. The cafe, when I reached it, looked tired. The usual morning bustle was subdued. Through the window, I could see Brenda inside, fussing with a vase of slightly wilted flowers on the counter. She was attempting to tidy up, a futile effort. The place still had that lingering, cloying scent of her cheap floral air freshener, a desperate attempt to mask the underlying smell of anxiety and decay that had clung to it for weeks. It was a sad, pathetic perfume trying to cover up a much deeper rot. My heart gave a little thump, not of fear, but of readiness. I pushed open the door. The little bell above it gave a cheerful, almost mocking jingle. Brenda looked up, her face arranged in a polite, slightly strained smile of anticipation, expecting a stern-faced executive from Phoenix Enterprises. Her eyes scanned past me, looking for someone else, someone more important looking. Then her gaze snapped back to me, standing just inside the doorway. Her polite smile froze. It wobbled, then shattered like cheap glass. Her jaw literally dropped, her eyes widening in stunned disbelief. The color drained from her face, leaving it a pasty, sickly white. If I'd had any doubts about the sweetness of this moment, her expression wiped them all away. It was pure, unadulterated horror. Oh, yes. This was going to be even better than I'd imagined. I let the silence stretch, a delicious, heavy blanket settling over the cafe. The few remaining staff members, a couple of bewildered morning regulars sipping their coffee, all turned to stare, sensing the sudden, thick tension. I could feel their curious eyes on me, then on Brenda, then back to me. I took a slow breath, savoring the moment. I let my fingers trail lightly over the old wooden counter. My counter now. The familiar worn texture felt solid and real beneath my touch, a silent affirmation of ownership. It anchored me. Brenda opened her mouth, then closed it again, a strangled gasp caught in her throat. She looked like a fish gasping for air. The shock was so profound it was almost comical. Finally, when I felt the silence had reached its peak, when Brenda looked like she might either faint or explode, I spoke. My voice was calm, quiet, but it carried easily in the suddenly hushed room. I looked towards the large, ostentatious clock on the wall, a hideous gold-plated monstrosity that Brenda had always been ridiculously proud of, always tapping it pointedly whenever an employee was a second late. Its loud, clunky ticking seemed to mock her current predicament. "Brenda," I said, my gaze slowly shifting back to her. Her eyes were wide, darting around as if seeking an escape route that didn't exist. "You always had such a thing for punctuality." A small, cruel smile touched my lips. "Ironically, your time here is up." A collective intake of breath came from the onlookers. Brenda swayed slightly, gripping the counter for support. Her face was a mask of dawning, horrified comprehension. "You're fired," I stated, the words clear and precise, echoing her own pronouncement to me what felt like a lifetime ago. Only this time, they were delivered not with her grating, theatrical authority, but with a cold, quiet finality that brooked no argument. The satisfaction that bloomed in my chest was warm and expansive. This wasn't just revenge. This was justice, served on a slightly sticky cafe counter. Brenda finally found her voice, a pathetic, reedy squeak. You can't, how?" "Oh, but I can," I replied, my voice still even. "Phoenix Enterprises, meet your new owner, me." I gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. And as my first official act, I paused, letting her hang there for another second, twisting on the hook of her own disbelief. Then, I delivered the final, satisfying blow, gesturing towards the monstrous timepiece. "Please, take that ridiculous clock with you when you leave. Its ticking is giving me a headache." The silence that followed was broken only by a muffled snort from one of the regulars, quickly stifled. Brenda stared at me, her face a battleground of shock, fury, and utter, crushing humiliation. For a moment, I thought she might actually lunge at me, but then something seemed to break inside her. Her shoulders slumped. The fight drained out of her, leaving behind an empty, defeated husk. She looked, for the first time since I'd known her, truly small. Without another word, she turned, her movements stiff and jerky, and walked towards the back office, the small, cluttered room where she had delivered so many of her own petty tyrannies. The door clicked shut behind her with a quiet finality. The reign of Brenda was officially over. The air in the cafe suddenly felt lighter, cleaner, even with the lingering scent of her cheap perfume. Brenda didn't take her ridiculous clock. She left it hanging there, a monument to her own bad taste, probably too stunned or too humiliated to even think about it. After she scuttled out of the back office, red-faced and tight-lipped, avoiding everyone's gaze, a strange quiet fell over the cafe. Then, one of the regulars, old Mrs. Henderson, no relation to the accountant, just a delightful coincidence, started to clap. Slowly at first, then more people joined in. It wasn't a thunderous ovation, just a soft, appreciative applause that made my cheeks flush but also warmed me from the inside out. The air, finally free of Brenda's oppressive aura, seemed to sparkle. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. I closed the cafe for a full renovation. Gone was the gloomy decor, the chipped formica, and especially that hideous clock. I donated it to a charity shop, hoping it would find a new, equally clueless owner. We painted the walls in warm, inviting colors, brought in comfortable, slightly mismatched furniture, and filled the space with plants and local art. The delicious scent of fresh paint and new beginnings filled the air, a welcome change from stale coffee and despair. I renamed it the Second Chance Cafe. It felt right. It was my second chance, after all. When we reopened, the place was buzzing. Light streamed through the newly cleaned windows, illuminating the cheerful interior. The aroma of genuinely fresh coffee, a rich, dark roast I'd sourced myself, mingled with the heavenly scent of my actual signature pastries baking in the new ovens. People loved it. They loved the atmosphere, the friendly staff I'd hired, and treated with actual respect. And, of course, the food. It was everything I'd ever dreamed my little cafe could be, a dream Brenda had nearly crushed. Then, one busy afternoon, about a month after the grand reopening, the bell above the door jingled less cheerfully. I looked up from behind the gleaming new counter, my hands dusted with flour. There, framed in the doorway, stood Brenda. She was disheveled. That's the only word for it. Her usually severe hairstyle was messy, her clothes looked slept in, and there was a faint but distinct scent of desperation clinging to her. Sharper and sadder than her old, cheap perfume, it made my stomach clench with a complicated mix of pity and disgust. She sidled up to the counter, avoiding the curious glances of the customers. Her eyes, when they met mine, were watery and bloodshot. "Sarah," she began, her voice a hoarse whisper, a shadow of its former grating command. I need to talk to you." I nodded, gesturing to a quiet corner table. I wiped my hands on my apron, a sturdy, cheerful blue one. As she launched into her plea, I mostly listened. It was a pathetic, blame-shifting monologue. It was the economy's fault, her supplier's fault, Mr. Henderson's fault for being a sneaky old man, even Liam's fault for giving her bad advice. Never, not once, did she take an ounce of responsibility for her own actions. She begged for a job, any job. "I can wash dishes," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "I'm a hard worker. You know I am. I made some mistakes." The desperation in her voice was palpable, but so was the underlying bitterness. It was a truly cringeworthy performance. I kept my expression neutral, just letting her words fill the space between us. What could I possibly say to that torrent of self-pity? Later that same week, as if summoned by the same desperate vibes, Liam appeared. He'd clearly heard about Brenda's failed attempt and decided to try his own luck. He swaggered in, attempting his old charming smile, though it looked strained around the edges. He was wearing that expensive cologne I once told him I liked, a scent that now just smelled cloyingly manipulative. He leaned against the counter just like he used to, trying to ooze charisma. It didn't work, not anymore. The smooth, polished surface of my new counter seemed to repel him. "Sarah," he said, his voice a low purr, "you've done wonders with this place. Truly." He apologized profusely for everything. He blamed Brenda's toxic influence, claiming she'd twisted his arm, clouded his judgment. He painted himself as another victim of her schemes. He even had the audacity to hint at a fresh start for us, a "we could be great together" kind of vibe. I almost laughed out loud. Did he really think I was that naive, that forgetful? The arrogance was astounding. He droned on, his voice a smooth, insincere melody that grated on my nerves worse than Brenda's lectures ever had. I met them separately as they had come. I let each of them have their say, listening patiently until their torrent of excuses and pleas trickled to a halt. There was a certain power in that, just listening, not reacting, letting them expose their true, pathetic selves. When Brenda finally ran out of steam, her shoulders slumped in defeat, I looked her dead in the eye. Her gaze flickered away, unable to meet mine for long. And then, a few days later, when Liam finished his own performance, his charming smile faltering as I remained unmoved, I did the same with him. My voice, when I finally spoke to each of them, was quiet, devoid of the anger and hurt they had once caused me. That had burned away, leaving something cleaner, stronger. No, I said, just no. To Brenda, I added, your actions had consequences, Brenda. You made your choices, again and again. This cafe, my success, it's a consequence, too, of me finally making mine. To Liam, I said, you also made your choices, Liam. Blaming Brenda doesn't change that. My rebirth, as strange as it sounds, gave me the clarity to see people for who they truly are, and to ensure that consequences are just. There was no triumph in my voice, no desire to rub salt in their wounds. There was just the quiet, unshakable finality of a closed door. A door I was now firmly bolting shut on that chapter of my life. They had played their parts in my past, but they had no place in my future. Their expressions, first of disbelief, then dawning comprehension, and finally a sort of hollow acceptance, told me they understood. There would be no more chances from me. The story of us, of them, and me was well and truly over.